Thank you very much. It's a really great pleasure to be here on this important gathering. As you've heard, it is a challenge to try to compress many decades of research on nutrition and health into 20 minutes, but to make it doubly daunting, it's following Bill Clinton, who is certainly the best communicator in America and an absolutely inspiring figure. So let me go forward and just briefly, the goal of this presentation is to identify dietary patterns that provide optimal health and well-being to the world's population, recognizing the dual burden of under and overnutrition that we've already heard about. And to do so in an environmentally sustainable way that, in the sense of considering greenhouse gas production, land use that's needed to maintain biodiversity, water availability, avoid antibiotic resistance, and of course, consider many other environmental factors at the same time. I'm going to be focusing mainly on the chronic disease aspect of dietary consequences for a couple of reasons. As you'll see in the summary from the Global Burden of Health analysis, cardiovascular disease is the #1 cause of death around the world and in almost every country today. But also looking down the list, diabetes seems fairly far down there in 1990, but it greatly increased during the last 20 years, approximately doubling in its rate. And this is particularly a good indicator of the metabolic state of the world because this directly reflects our dietary intakes and our levels of physical activity. It's the precursor of many other conditions. And it has the potential to continue doubling. That, for example, in the United States, if we look at the American Indian population, the rates are 50 to 70% prevalence in adults. And there's really no good reason that that can't happen in many other parts of the world if the present trends continue. The types of evidence that we use in evaluating the relationship between diet and health are multiple. I won't discuss these in detail, but essentially we use ecological studies comparing different countries, large populations, controlled feeding studies of small numbers of people, cohort studies, and randomized trials. Ideally, probably most of you are aware that randomized trials are considered the highest level of scientific evidence, but when it comes to the issue of diet and health, they have many limitations, in particular because adherence to diets for many years, if we want to look at cancer or heart disease, is very difficult. It usually doesn't work very well, and at best, these studies are extremely costly to conduct. Because they can actually give misleading answers, relatively few have been conducted. And so most of what we know is based on cohort studies and controlled feeding studies. But taking those in combination, we can get to a high level of certainty. These are some of the examples of large cohort studies, specifically the ones conducted by our group at Harvard University. 3 large studies collectively, including over 250,000 men and women who we've been following since 1980 for dietary intake. And arguably these are the most detailed such studies because we've been in contact with participants every 2 years, updating dietary information every 4 years, and of course also keeping track of smoking, physical activity, and other behaviors so we can control for those when we want to look at, say, the relationship between a specific type of fat and risk of a cancer or cardiovascular disease or dementia. There are now several dozen of these large cohort studies being conducted around the world, and they've added a vast amount of information that we did not have available just even 20 years ago. One aspect that's very important in looking at dietary factors and health is the substitution principle. That in general, if you want to look at a major part of the diet like saturated fat intake, you can't just add that on top of everything else. You have to substitute it or compare it to something else in an analysis that we might do. And one point I wanted to emphasize here is if we're looking at saturated fat and then just comparing it to everything else in the diet, most of what we consume in the United States is unhealthy carbohydrates. That's the major part, that half our calories are from carbohydrates. Most of that is refined starch and sugar. So it's a very different question comparing saturated fat to those calories than, say, something specific like polyunsaturated fat or monounsaturated fat. So in more recent years, we've been able to do more specific analyses comparing one aspect of diet with another directly, so it is explicit. For example, this is what we published a few years ago looking at type of fat in the diet in relationship with coronary heart disease, comparing each type of fat with the same number of calories from carbohydrate. And as you can see, trans fat was by far the worst. Saturated fat was very weakly related to risk of heart disease compared to the same number of calories from carbohydrate. But monounsaturated fat, and even more so polyunsaturated fat, were related to lower risk of coronary heart disease. So total fat in the diet was not related to heart disease. In fact, we've not seen it related to any important health outcome. But the type of fat is indeed very important. And to reduce your heart disease, you can, as you could see from this, you'd replace trans fat and saturated fat with some combination of unsaturated fat. Importantly, this observation has been reproduced many times, and this is a very solid piece of evidence that fits with the controlled feeding studies. So that's an example of one piece of evidence that we can use as we give guidance to what would be a healthy diet. We've also done analyses based on foods, not nutrients, and this, of course, has very direct practical implications. This is in the same study population looking at major dietary protein sources. And this I emphasize a bit here because it has major implications for environmental consequences as well as health consequences, which is what we're looking at here, risk of heart disease specifically. Without going into all the details, if you look at the bottom, replacing red meat with poultry, fish, nuts, or beans provides the strongest reduction in risk. The vertical line in the middle is a sort of a relative risk of 1, meaning it's neutral, and everything to the left of that means reduction in risk of coronary heart disease. In this analysis and everything I'll be showing you, we're adjusting statistically for smoking, physical activity, and other variables that might be confounding factors. We've also looked at this in the same kind of analysis at risk of diabetes in relation to major protein sources. So again, replacing red meat with nuts or whole grains gives you the largest reduction in risk of type 2 diabetes, but there's also lower risk with low-fat dairy, poultry, and fish. We've also more recently looked at the relationship between red meat and total mortality. In some ways, this is sort of a public health bottom line. And this is looking at unprocessed red meat, NHS, that's Nurses' Health Study of Women on the left, and on the men is a cohort of health professionals. And for both of these populations, we see with increasing intake of unprocessed red meat, increasing total mortality. And we've also looked at this for processed red meat. The association is a little bit stronger, but clearly increasing risks of death with higher intakes of both unprocessed and processed red meat. We've conducted this kind of analysis looking at substitutions, and again, the best trade-off, given the same number of servings per day, is nuts replacing red meat, but legumes, low-fat dairy, whole grains, poultry, fish, all are related to substantially lower risks of death. As I mentioned, The process in science of reproducing findings is critically important. Almost never is one study definitive on its own, but this relationship with total mortality has been reproduced in other large populations. This in a very large population of men and women conducted by our National Cancer Institute, showing, again, clear positive associations between red meat consumption, whether it's processed or total red meat, and risk of overall mortality. However, it is in recent years, just the last several years, that we're starting to have data from the developing parts of the world. And this is looking at red meat and overall mortality in Asia. And there is a bit of a different picture that is emerging there, where there's really not much relationship seen in studies. This is a summary of multiple studies from different parts of Asia, and the relationship is rather flat between red meat consumption and total mortality. Red meat may have a different meaning because it is quite strongly related to upper income, which is likely to affect overall health and mortality. Also, the amounts are much lower than in the Western countries. And thirdly, that in most of Asia, the vast majority of calories are coming from unhealthy sources, white rice and other refined starches providing very large portions of the diet. So something with some nutritional value that provides some dietary diversity in that context could actually be beneficial. And that is important to keep in mind, that we do see somewhat different relationships depending on the background diet. Carbohydrate quality is also turning out to be something that's extremely important in health and well-being in all countries around the world. In almost every diet, in fact, I think every diet for a large group of people, carbohydrates are the major source of calories, and it's received less attention until recently. Defining carbohydrate quality is not quite so simple, but I find it useful to look at carbohydrate quality in two dimensions. One, the amount of fiber in the carbohydrate, meaning more whole grains if it's higher fiber, or glycemic load or glycemic index, which represents the speed at which we convert carbohydrates to sugar once we digest it. And what we've shown here is that the combination of high glycemic load, meaning lots of highly refined, rapidly absorbed carbohydrates, and low cereal fiber, is related to a 2.5-fold increase in risk of type 2 diabetes. And this has been, we've reproduced this in all three of our studies, and there's lots of evidence that these two dimensions of carbohydrate are both important. In addition to increased risk of type 2 diabetes, we see higher glycemic load is related to higher risk of coronary heart disease. That's going from front to back here in the Nurses' Health Study. But also there is an interaction with body mass index, which is a good indicator of underlying insulin resistance. And this shows in a simple figure what I think is happening in the transition that's occurring all around the world. It used to be that most of the world was, especially poorer countries of the world, were lean and highly active. Here in our population, a relatively small fraction have a body mass index less than 23. And if you're lean and active, we can metabolize and utilize our carbohydrate much more effectively. We need much less insulin. But if we're a little bit, or even normal weight or a little bit overweight, then we respond very poorly metabolically when we consume that same high glycemic load diet. And of course, what's happening around the world is that we are transitioning, even in the poorest countries, from being very lean and very active to being somewhat less active and even just a modest amount greater body mass index, more obesity. And once we make that transition, then we respond very much more adversely to what might even be the same diet. So that is, I think, one of the most important drivers of what we see as this skyrocketing rate of type 2 diabetes that I showed in one of the first slides. again, fortunately, we are now having some data directly from cohort studies in developing countries. This from the Shanghai Women's Health Study now showing, for example, that there's a very strong relationship between consumption of white rice and risk of type 2 diabetes, and which is obviously a huge problem because that is the staple in the vast number of Asian diets. Of course, I think everyone understands that fruits and vegetables are important for good health. Somewhat surprising as the better studies have come in, we've seen very little relationship between fruit and vegetable consumption and cancer risk, as shown on the top, just flat across the increasing levels of fruit and vegetable consumption from less than 1.5 serving a day to 8 or more. But for cardiovascular disease, as shown at the bottom, there is a strong benefit. One area that is still not totally resolved from epidemiologic data on long-term health consequences is dairy consumption. And I mention this in particular here because the ecological footprint of dairy production is very large in terms of greenhouse gas production and land use, water use, energy inputs. And there has been a strong belief in nutrition circles that we need to consume dairy products and high calcium intakes to prevent fractures. But my colleagues here in Sweden had looked at this, could not find any relationship between milk consumption and fracture risk. Here, actually, Sweden has the highest fracture rate in the world and also about the highest milk consumption in the world, too. And it's been an enigma why there should not be lower fracture rates given the high dairy consumption here. But we looked at this in our populations. We also found in adults no relationship between milk consumption and fracture risk. This is a summary of all the world's literature. You can see it's just perfectly flat. Now, it's been said that we especially need the high dairy consumption during adolescence and childhood because bones are growing, which we clearly need more calcium. But we've looked at this. This is adolescent consumption of milk and relation to hip fracture risk later in life. I think for women, there's no benefit during adolescence, and for men, there's actually a positive association. And I think looking at this further, that one of the reasons Sweden and US and Northern Europe has high fracture rates actually is because we drink so much milk. We have definitive evidence that makes us grow taller, and then our bones break more easily because a short stick is harder to break than a long skinny stick, basically. So putting this and lots of other data all together, I think there is pretty good consensus among the nutrition world that the global healthy diet could be defined very simply by 4 primary elements. Proteins coming mainly from legumes, nuts, and fish, modest amounts of poultry and dairy, especially as yogurt and cheese if we're going to have dairy. Red meat to be used sparingly at most, and processed meats avoided. Healthy fats from unsaturated vegetable oil such as olive oil, sunflower oil, and others with inclusion of omega-3 fatty acids are the healthy forms of fat. Whole grains, but minimal amounts of refined carbohydrate and sugar, and generous and varied intake of fruits and vegetables. A basic healthy diet is pretty simple. And interestingly, that does represent what the Mediterranean diet is. And among the traditional diets, this has been examined with many kinds of studies and has stood out as being associated with the best long-term health outcomes, longevity, and low rates of chronic disease. And at this point in time, now it's useful, having looked at the elements and come to the same conclusion, we can put together those elements in using other dietary traditions that use other flavors, other fats, other protein sources, but still come out to a similarly healthy diet. Fortunately, the healthy diet, again, does align pretty well with what we know about the environmental consequences of dietary choices. This is looking at greenhouse gas emissions per gram of protein. This is a relative scale. And as you can see, by far the highest emissions are with lamb, beef, milk, dairy production, and the lowest emissions with lentils, chicken, dry beans, tofu, and some forms of aquaculture would fall in there as well. A number of analyses have also been done looking at different dietary patterns. On the left there is the US government MyPlate, and then that's been compared with our alternative version of that, led by Lillian Chung, putting together what we see to be the elements of a healthy diet. And this has less dairy, less red meat, less grain, less land use, and almost for sure less greenhouse gas and other environmental impacts as well. Just actually this last week, an analysis was published of the new Nordic diet, comparing it to the average Danish diet. And it was quite interesting. The new Nordic diet did have quite a bit lower environmental impact. As you can see, about 70% less greenhouse gas production on the right. But the red column is the impact of red meat, and the next category is dairy. So you can see there's still lots of potential for reducing the environmental impact even further by reducing those aspects of the diet. And finally, another way of looking at this picture is to look at the crop acreage that's used in the country to produce different foods. And this is the US. We're probably the worst case scenario. As you can see, the vast majority of land use goes into producing cereal grains, oilseeds, and wheat. The vast majority of that is actually fed to animals or used for conversion to ethanol to drive automobiles. And fruit and vegetables is and nuts combined are all just a little short column. They're utilizing much less than 5% of total land. So you can see there is a capacity, if we stop feeding the grains to animals, we could dramatically reduce land use and multiply many times fruit and vegetable production. So to conclude, healthy and sustainable diet is a dietary pattern characterized by unsaturated fats, largely plant-based proteins, whole grains, abundant fruits and vegetables, and this can provide overall good health and low rates of non-communicable diseases and total mortality. This dietary pattern also has lower environmental impacts than the current widely recommended Western dietary patterns, where, for example, we recommend 3 servings of dairy a day, and Canada recommends 4. Sweden, I think, consumes something in that ballpark. Further research is needed to minimize the environmental impacts of each element of this dietary pattern. So for each food, we can do better, producing it more efficiently with lower environmental impact, and clearly that needs a lot of effort, as well as shifting the types of food that we consume. Economic policies are needed to promote the production and consumption of these foods, emphasized by Prince Charles. And reducing the use of grains for feed and fuel would have major benefits both for health and the environment. And I do want to add that continued high population growth in some regions could outstrip even the strong efforts to develop a sustainable, healthy food supply for the world. I think we can't take our eyes off of that aspect as well. Thank you.